Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Korean Politics Debrief with me, Kwon Jang-ho. Let's start with a recap of what's been going on since last week. It's been a strangely quiet week in Korean politics. President Yoon Suk Yeol's impeachment trial at the Constitutional Court wrapped up hearings, and in the final hearing, President Yoon spoke for about an hour, but he mostly went over the same talking points that we'd heard before, that he had declared martial law as a warning to the public, and that he didn't intend to suppress the people, that he didn't order the arrest of politicians or order lawmakers to be dragged out from the National Assembly. He did say, though, that he would pursue constitutional reform if he were reinstated, hinting at a 2 4-year presidential term rather than the single 5-year term currently. That rather came out of left field, but it didn't really change much. The hearings are over, and a ruling is set to come around mid-March. That schedule seemed further likely despite the Constitutional Court also making a ruling last week that the current acting president, Jae Sang-mok, violated the Constitution by only appointing 2 of 3 justices nominated for the court earlier this year. That meant that President Yoon's impeachment trial has been presided over by 8 justices rather than the full bench of 9. But even though the court ruled that acting President Chair had overstepped his powers by refusing to appoint the final justice, it also said that the court cannot compel him to appoint the 9th justice. And there doesn't seem to be any sign that Chair will appoint the justice anytime soon. So it's quite the bizarre situation. The court ruled that Chair had violated the Constitution, but it couldn't compel him to make the appointment. The Democratic Party could impeach Chair as well, leading to an acting president to take the helm. And the court has essentially said that it's an impeachable offense, so it would likely be successful. But that still wouldn't mean that the 9th justice seat is filled. So it does look like President Yoon's impeachment trial will conclude with just 8 justices making the decision, and so no delay to the mid-March schedule. Elsewhere, the appellate trial of the Democratic Party leader and leading presidential contender Lee Jae-myung began. In the first trial, he was given a 1-year prison sentence, suspended for 2 years for lying when he was running for president during the 2022 election. A 1-year prison sentence means that he would be ineligible to run in the next presidential election, but only if that sentence is upheld in this appellate trial and a subsequent Supreme Court trial. The appellate trial verdict is set to come on March 26th, but even if the sentence is upheld, it appears that Lee's grip on the party is strong enough that he would still be the party's nominee, as there is really no way that a Supreme Court ruling would come in time, assuming that the impeachment trial verdict comes mid-March and the election takes place 60 days later in mid-May. So this trial, while it will be closely watched, its consequences do not seem that weighty for now. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party forced through a bill to launch a special counsel investigation into the Myung-tae-gyun scandal and whether President Yoon or the First Lady Kim Gun-hee was involved in a deal with the so-called power broker to pick their party's candidate for a by-election seat. But acting President Chair is likely to veto this bill, and it's unlikely to pass the 2/3 majority needed in the National Assembly to overturn that veto as well. So this is just another bill railroaded through by the Democratic Party, it seems, for show. The rival parties and the government also decided to hold a meeting to discuss pension reform and a much-needed supplementary budget, and a special law that seeks to exempt semiconductor workers from the 52-hour work week, but that fell through over partisan bickering, and so no progress there. Presidential hopeful and former People Power Party chief Han Dong-un released his book, 국민이 먼저입니다, The People Come First. But like the other PPP contenders, they of course cannot officially declare their bids yet until Yoon's impeachment is upheld. So, as I said, it's been a strangely quiet week, or perhaps I should say that there was little ground gained, like trench warfare. it seems like we're in a holding pattern now. No big movements being made as the nation holds its breath to wait for the 8 Constitutional Court justices to make their ruling on President Yoon's impeachment in a couple of weeks' time. So, amid this situation, in this episode, I talked to Professor Benjamin Engel, who is a sort of cross between a political science expert and a historian of modern Korean politics. I wanted to once again look back at President Yoon's decision to declare martial law and try to make sense of it, but looking at it from a much broader perspective in the wider context of modern Korean history. And it was an absolutely fascinating discussion. So here it is now. This interview was recorded Thursday, February 27th. Okay, so here with me now is Benjamin Engel. He is an assistant professor of Korean studies at Dankook University. Or I should say, you're a newly appointed assistant professor of Korean studies at Dankook University, right?
That's right.
You begin your new role in March?
That's right.
Okay, well, congratulations.
Thank you.
First and foremost, then. Now, our listeners may know Professor Engel from his posts on social media, formerly on Twitter and X, and nowadays on Blue Sky, right? He's been making some very enlightening and insightful observations on Korean politics and modern history for some time now, I would say. And I definitely recommend our listeners to follow him if you aren't already. Well, we're going to be talking more about President Yoon Suk Yeol's impeachment trial and all the fallout from it, and try to explore maybe why he did what he did as well. But first, let's learn a bit more about you, Professor Engel. So you can tell us a bit about yourself. Can you give us a brief introduction and, tell us about yourself?
Sure. I'm originally from St. Louis, Missouri in the United States. I've been living in South Korea since August of 2010, so coming up on 15-year anniversary. When I first arrived in South Korea, I did a year of language school at Seoul National University's Institute for Teaching Korean Language. Then I, transitioned to the Graduate School of International Studies at SNU, where I did a master's degree in Korean Studies. I took a year off and then resumed my studies and did a PhD in Korean Studies. My research mostly focuses on the history of U.S.-South Korea relations during the Korean War. But being Korean studies scholar means you kind of have to have a somewhat deep understanding of Korea in a variety of fields, right? So not only history, but of course politics, Korean society, also extending up to North Korea. So I really try to cover all the bases as best as I can.
How did you first become interested in Korea?
So when I was an undergraduate, I did my undergraduate studies at the University of Missouri. And Missouri as a state has a kind of long history of relations with Korea because the president during the outbreak of the Korean War was President Truman, who was from Independence, Missouri. And so when Korean people interested in doing advanced studies in America from Korea were first coming over, President Truman sent many of them to the University of Missouri. So the University of Missouri has a very large alumni network in South Korea. Actually, you wouldn't expect that, right? Missouri, kind of a middle of nowhere in America. But we have a very large alumni network. I think 2 members of the National Assembly currently studied at the University of Missouri. Lots of politicians. Economics was a very popular major amongst Koreans there. So we have a very wide network. And that relationship has continued to the current day. And when I was an undergrad, there were many Korean students coming over as exchange students, some doing their complete 4-year degrees, others, graduate school, some doing, just short-term projects. But I was a collegiate ambassador. So I got to meet many Korean undergrads, talk with them about, mostly just about having fun and, going out drinking, learning about soju and that type of stuff. But, also hearing their stories. And one of the things that really stuck with me from meeting the students was we had students coming from Gwangju and also from Busan. So I got an introduction right away to regionalism in Korean politics from, the students coming from the different areas of South Korea. And that's one of the things that really sparked my interest in Korean politics.
So even though they were young students, you could feel their political colors, you're saying?
They weren't too. This is kind of before polarization became too serious in Korea, but they definitely had different outlooks. And the students from Gwangju were quick to talk about the Gwangju democracy movement. Um, Not that the students from Busan or anything would try to deny that or were Park Chung-hee worshippers or anything, but they would point out that our regions have different political tendencies, and Gwangju's for the Democratic Party, and the Gyeongsang provinces are usually for the Conservative Party. And I thought that was very interesting, and that kind of really sparked my interest into learning more about Korean history, how this came about, and that's how I became interested in the Cold War era and Park Chung-hee in particular.
All right. And then as you continued your studies and you came to Korea, can you give us your overall thoughts and impressions on Korean politics and Korean democracy? For example, if anyone from your hometown were to come talk to you and ask you what's interesting about Korean politics, what you make of it, what would you tell them? How would you describe Korean politics, do you think?
So this could be because I focus on the history of Korea in the 1970s in particular so heavily. But I really am consistently fascinated by how Korean politics is still, in many ways, a battle that is drawn, that has continued from even the 1950s and 60s, 70s, 80s, between two forces, a kind of military authoritarian perspective and the democracy movement. And that is still one of the main battles in Korean politics. So, Yoon Suk Yeol kind of labels these, former democracy protesters as anti-state forces, pro-North Korea. That's the same thing they were labeled as in the 1980s and 1970s. During the Moon Jae-in administration, there was a movement to eradicate, these former evils, which was mainly referring to the legacies of authoritarianism in the 80s and 70s. So the two political forces still clearly draw their legacies from this battle over democratization in Korea's recent past. And so, how that still, forms the contours of Korean politics is very interesting to me, and something I point out to people who, aren't familiar with it.
It's very tumultuous still, right? There's a rawness to, I think, Korean politics and Korean democracy still compared to a lot of other, particularly Western countries, would you say?
Yeah, definitely. And that comes from, the people who are, lawmakers for the most part, especially in the Democratic Party, were the people who are on the streets, right, in the 1980s and protesting for democratization. So when you spend your youth deeply embroiled in these very life and death matters, right? Some of these democracy protesters were arrested, imprisoned. Few of them were, gave their lives for this cause. And so that gives you a lot of skin in the game, to put it mildly. And so, when you see something like martial law happen, you have this visceral reaction to it. And I think, in a sense, that's why we saw this extreme reaction to what Yoon Suk Yeol did last December. And when you see what's happening in the United States, that in some ways is just as dangerous, although it's kind of moving slower. You don't have that same kind of visceral reaction because Americans, for the most part, don't understand what authoritarianism is like, the very real costs of it. And so while many Koreans, particularly of that 386 generation, do have that direct experience.
That brings us on to our main topic, which is, again, of course, the impeachment with President Yoon Suk Yeol and the martial law decree and everything that goes with that. Looking back at December 3rd and what happened, what do you make of it, especially as a historian, as someone who interested in history?
So a friend and colleague of mine, Kieran McRae, were writing an article about this. And what we see is that there's kind of two perspectives to trying to understand how martial law came about under Yoon last December. The first is kind of a Yoon kind of breaking down Korean democracy, right? So over the last couple of years, we've had some changes in Korean democracy, most notably the increasing political polarization. And Yoon kind of rode this wave of polarization into martial law, and it was kind of a throwback to the authoritarian era, something we shouldn't see in contemporary Korean politics. The other perspective, which we're kind of hoping to illuminate, is that yes, 1987, the year of Korea's democratization, was of course a very momentous experience. The reinstatement of direct presidential elections, which have been suspended in Korea since 1972, was very important. But that democratization in 1987 didn't get rid of all the things that had characterized Korean politics in the 1970s and 80s in particular. It was a negotiated democratization, right? Chun Doo-han, No Tae-woo sat down at a table essentially with Kim Dae-jung, Kim Yong-sam, and they talked about what the political system was going to be like in the future, and that's how we got the Constitution of 1987. And because this was a negotiated democratization, the former authoritarians still had a seat at the table, right? They weren't kicked out. This wasn't a revolution. They weren't overthrown. They were tried and found guilty, but they were quickly pardoned by Kim Dae-jung. Kim Song-sam on the assistance of Kim Dae-jung, but they were not really discredited, right? Their whole belief structure, their whole many of their policies, in particular their economic development policies, were still highly touted in Korean society. And so this gave a way for the authoritarian legacy to live on and even be praised in many circles in Korea. And so it's in this backdrop of the authoritarians of the past having this space to continue operating in Korean society that made it possible, I think, for Yoon Suk Yeol to declare martial law, right? There were many people in Korea who were welcoming of that, and we see that today. And also, even after martial law, right, the election conspiracy theories also have a very long history in South Korean politics, for good reason. During the authoritarian era, especially the Seungman-rhee era, right, there was lots of election fraud in South Korea, and that was what really kicked off the April 1960 revolution that overthrew Seungman-rhee, but also during the Park Chung-hee era, before he declared martial law and extended his rule indefinitely, there was lots of concern about election fraud in the 1960s. But even after 1987, right, when Roh Moo-hyun was elected in 2002, the Hannara-dang, the forebearer of the People Power Party, also at that time cried election fraud and brought cases to court. And there were recounts of votes in, I think, some 80 precincts to recount the votes for the 2002 presidential election. There were a few inconsistencies found, obviously nowhere near enough to change the results of the election. But this is something that has a long history in Korean politics. Not only fraud, but also good reason. Again, in 2012, eventually we had the National Intelligence Service, right, admit that they had an influencing operation to try and change the outcomes of the election in which Park Geun-hye won. So a lot of, especially the foreign media, tries to portray these election conspiracies in the framework of Donald Trump's 2020 Stop the Steal type of thing. And in a sense, that's not wrong, but we also have to remember there's a very long history of this in South Korea. And so this is something that definitely predates Donald Trump and has been a part of Korean politics for decades.
They've co-opted the Stop the Steal slogan, but there's a long history of saying that is what I find very interesting about the current situation. A lot of this isn't new, like martial law isn't new, impeachment isn't new, all these conspiracy theories, they're not new. But I do feel like the details are quite unprecedented. I feel like President Yoon and the way he declared martial law, it wasn't the natural course of what we might have expected. You're saying the groundwork was there, but still, for me, when I look at what happened on December 3rd, it feels like a blip rather than something that we might have expected down the line. In the past military coups and the past elections and the political strife, they all feel like it was a part of a narrative. Whereas what happened December 3rd, as I said, it feels like a blip. I don't know about you.
It definitely felt like it because it actually happened, but I'm not sure how much of it was a blip in the long scheme of things, right? When Park Geun-hye was impeached in 2016-17, right, is when the protests were going on. We later got reports that her government was planning to implement martial law, right? And then the plans that Kim Jong-un used to actually carry out martial law this time were in part based on the plan that had been already made. So the political decision to actually follow through was, of course, new, but this wasn't something that previous Korean conservative presidents hadn't thought about before, right? Park Geun-hye had considered it. It's unlikely that perhaps Lee Myung-bak, because he wasn't facing the same kind of life or death political situation in terms of impeachment. But it wasn't new, is what's scary, and that makes it even scarier going forward. Right now, there's a precedent of somebody actually carrying through, and why I think impeaching Yoon Suk Yeol is very important right now to make it very clear that this is not okay in South Korea's current democracy.
So you're saying that we might have been able to see this coming almost? Where were you when martial law was declared, and what was your immediate reaction?
I would say that in hindsight, it seems like it was a little bit foreseeable, but I was definitely shocked. I don't think there was anybody who wasn't shocked.
Right.
It seemed so ridiculous to make that decision, and I think that's why the Park Geun-hye government didn't implement it, because there was no way it was going to succeed, right? Given the strength of South Korea's civil society, the overwhelming support for democracy as a system of government in South Korea made the idea of actually implementing martial law, too impossible to believe. And so when the Democratic Party was, making their statements that, Yoon Suk Yeol is considering implementing martial law, a few months before it actually happened, most people, including myself, was like, this is ridiculous. He's not going to actually do it, because there's no way it would succeed. And so I think the way that martial law failed was easy to kind of foresee coming, but that there would actually be somebody stupid enough to make that political decision to carry it out was hard to foresee.
So you're not surprised it failed. President Yoon said it was deliberate that it failed, that he wasn't intending for it to succeed and to suppress the Korean people, but it was about sending a warning to the Korean people about an emergency crisis that the nation is facing. Is there a way, do you think, that he could have done it to make it succeed?
That was kind of the trick of it. To have it be successful, he needed a lot more help, right? He needed more soldiers. He needed more commanders within the military on board with it. But in the planning stages, the further he would have opened up the more people to help him plan for this coming coup, the more likely it was to be exposed early on, right? And to make it impossible to implement. So he was really in a difficult dilemma, right? I need more help, but the broader I open the circle, the likelihood of it failing before I even start increases. But I think it was very possible for him to succeed that night if things had gone a little bit differently, if the military had been more aggressive in carrying out his orders to drag out, politicians from the National Assembly to prevent them from passing the resolution to end martial law, if the police had acted swifter to start imprisoning some of the politicians on his hit list of people to put in custody. So it was definitely, it seemed like the system was intentionally slow rolling the martial law orders, and that is why it failed. But if there had been more planning, more wide scale understanding of what was coming, and the right people who agreed with him in place on that night to carry out his orders, then it probably may have been closer to success than it was.
Do you think he wanted it to succeed? Because we know he's saying that he didn't intend for it to succeed, that that wasn't part of the plan. This was the plan, that it was meant to be just a coup that would only last a couple of hours. I think this is my difficulty with this situation, trying to figure out what he really believes and what he's now saying post what happened, as his defense, as perhaps his legal defense, as a political defense about what happened.
So I'm of the opinion that he wanted it to succeed. And because it failed so spectacularly, he's now trying to use that as a defense to get out of being impeached and likely imprisoned. Um, if we And there's no reason, in my opinion, to not believe the testimony that he ordered politicians to be imprisoned, that he ordered lawmakers to be drug out of the National Assembly. If he did give those orders, that to me is a clear evidence that he wanted a martial law to succeed, that this wasn't some warning to the people, that our state of political affairs is in disarray. This wasn't a attempt to uncover evidence of election fraud. To me, those orders, specifically with the National Assembly, was evidence that he wanted this to succeed, and he was trying to overturn the constitutional order in South Korea. Also, right, the order to prepare a new legislature to, implement laws after the National Assembly is closed. There's just so much of it from so many different people that it seems like there was a clear plan in place to close the National Assembly and subvert the Constitution. And that it failed so spectacularly has, in a way, given Yoon wiggle room to try and to argue that he didn't intend to do that. But it seems pretty clear to me that he did.
If what you're saying is right, if that is what he intended but it failed, if we go down that path, then how do you make sense of what he wanted? Of what the extreme lengths that he was going to go to essentially then reshape the nation in his own image in where he wanted?
That seems to be where he was going. And I think we got glimpses of his authoritarian nature before martial law, his approach towards the media, right? Kicking NBC off of his presidential plane and trying to suppress negative reporting. We also had glimpses of him, talking positively about Chun Doo-hwan and people in the past, and putting people in positions of power who did have similar opinions to that. We see that he essentially seems to have put Kim Yong-hong in the position of defense minister because he was going to be the one to help him, right, achieve these goals of subverting the Constitution. So it seems like that was his goal to me, was this power grab. When it comes to the election conspiracy, I can't really make up my mind whether he believes that, whether he drank the Kool-Aid, or whether he knows that a lot of people have drunk the election fraud conspiracy Kool-Aid and is trying to use that. So if we try to compare it to the Trump example in the US, we've seen every now and then examples of where Trump himself doesn't believe it, right? But he knows it's a very useful narrative for his base that to stop the steal, that the election was stolen. And it's very possible that Yoon Suk Yeol is using it as well, that he thinks it as a very useful narrative to help him subvert democracy and extend his time in power. So we'll have to see. I guess we don't have enough evidence really to say right now whether he believes it or not. But I guess the end result doesn't really matter, right? It resulted in the same declaration of martial law.
Right. I mean, I guess it's the same with any politician. Part of the challenge that people have when it comes to politicians is trying to figure out what they believe and what they're saying. What trying to figure out the difference. And I guess it's a sort of rabbit hole that we can never really get to the end of because we can't really see into President Yoon's mind.
Right.
So I guess we shouldn't go too far down this rabbit hole, but it is fascinating, and I guess it is still important because the people, a lot of the public at the moment believe what Yoon did was right and what he's doing, what he's thinking. What have you made of the public's reaction to President Yoon, and especially post impeachment, the case that he's been making? That again, there are allegations of election fraud, hints about Chinese interference. What do you make of the public kind of going along with that?
So we've seen for years, really since Park Geun-hye's impeachment, that there is definitely a sizable section of the Korean population that is still in this Cold War mentality, right? That North Korea is trying to subvert South Korea's democracy, that the Democratic Party and these politicians who used to be part of the democracy movement in the 1980s who were pretty open about, studying Juche ideology and Marxism and these types of things. Of course, they've changed since then, but, kind of assuming that they are still trying to support some sort of North Korean takeover. So they are, viscerally antagonistic towards the opposition party, towards the Democratic Party. They see them as, as Yoon described, the anti-state forces trying to pro-North Korea forces trying to help them, trying to help North Korea take over South Korea. So that there was a section that came out in support of Yoon was not particularly surprising to me. What I guess has been more surprising, and this has really been going on since Yoon was elected, is that the split in the younger generation, right, with
Right.
females tending to be more supportive of the Democratic Party and young men being more supportive of the Conservative Party. At first, it seemed like an economic, reasoning, right? Lee Jun-suk and that kind of brand of politician was promising to help young men, right? Economically, trying to help them be more successful. So if you believe that, then you are more likely to give your vote there. Understandable. What's been surprising to me is that they've kind of also jumped off the deep end, so to say, in terms of giving support to Yoon and these conspiracy theories. I didn't really see that coming, and I think it shows the extent to which some of these young men are willing to go to try to find someone to blame for the difficulties in their lives. If it's not us, it's China trying to come in and take over and subvert our democracy. That has been a captivating message for some of these young men has been pretty shocking to me.
If we paint more of a picture, so the latest opinion polls, one of the latest opinion polls, the one released by Real Meter on Monday, showed that 52% believe the Constitutional Court should uphold Yoon's impeachment. Only 52%, I would say. 45.1% said the court should reinstate him as president. So that's almost a 50-50 split. What do you make of these sorts of figures, these opinion polls that show that? Do you believe them? Do you think that's an accurate representation of what the Korean people are feeling at the moment?
It's hard for me to say. I'm not an expert in these polling systems, but what I have sort of been garnering is an understanding that the people answering these polls are those who are most politically active, right? So if you look at the answer rates to these are all done by phone, right? You get a call and they tell you that they're doing an opinion poll. If you don't really care about politics that too much, you're busy at the moment, you hang up. The people who actually go through and answer the entire survey are people who are very active politically, who want to have their voices heard. And definitely the most energized section of the Korean political spectrum right now is the far right, right? So they're out in the streets in very heavy numbers, much so more than the group supporting the impeachment. So the people perhaps more likely to answer the phone and pick up and answer these political polls are people in the far right, which might skew the results of these to look like there's more people supportive than there actually are. But however you kind of shake it down, we've seen growing support for Yoon Suk Yeol since impeachment. Whether 55-45 is the right number, if it's 60-40 or if it's 70-30, even 70-30 is kind of pretty shocking, right? Given what Yoon Suk Yeol did that day. So whatever the number is, there's still a pretty sizable minority in Korea that is supportive of Yoon Suk Yeol.
Do you think they're in support of Yoon Suk Yeol and what he believes, or do you think it is just about planting their belief in the conservative side, their flag in the conservative side?
Yeah, I think it's important to make a distinction there. There's definitely those who support Yoon Suk Yeol who are, full in on the conspiracy theories. There are people who are against the Democratic Party as a whole because they don't believe with their ideological philosophy or whatnot. And then there are also people who are probably just purely anti-Lee Jae-myung, right? Who don't think he is a good person, good politician, are nervous about various accusations that have been made about him. and don't want to see him become president. And so, there's probably, three different groups in there, various levels of support for Yoon, or just a purely anti-Democratic Party or anti Jae-myung. So that's definitely been a big variable, I think, in what's happening in terms of support for the Conservative Party and Yoon Suk Yeol. If anybody else with less of a criminal, liability was in charge of the Democratic Party and their likely presidential candidate, maybe we'd see a very different political landscape in South Korea right now.
Do you think that? Do you think that it's because it's Lee Jae-myung? Do you think if there was a different leader that it would be a different picture, you're saying? And why do you think they are so against Lee Jae-myung? Why do you think people, especially the conservatives here, they see his potential presidential success as a threat to the nation, that he's going to sell off the nation to Chinese forces? Or what is it? Why are they so afraid of Lee Jae-myung, do you think?
So I think the accusations that he, through this underwear company, right, sent funds to North Korea to try to secure a summit meeting with Kim Jong-un is a very visceral red flag for the older generation in Korea, right? These people who were born in the Korean War era and grew up during the authoritarian era, getting the very hardcore Cold War propaganda wired into them. Accusations like that are going to be a huge red flag for the older generation. For the younger generation people, I think his populism is upsetting some people. His corruption scandals are upsetting to a lot of people, right? I think it's been, we saw it with Park Geun-hye as well. The young generation's kind of visceral reaction to the corruption scandals surrounding her, and particularly Choi Shin-sil's daughter, right, getting the free ride into Iwa, not going to class. So these corruption allegations seem to be really damaging when it comes to the younger generation. The younger generation struggling economically. They don't see themselves having a very bright future, can't buy apartments, can't get married, can't have children. And then you have politicians over here, using their power to enrich themselves is very understandable. It makes a lot of people angry. So things like the Daejang-dong real estate scandal, I think, set off, upset a lot of people. So he gets that kind of slimy politician type of aura around him.
Sure, slimy politician, but they're seeing it was almost like an existential crisis for the nation if he were to be elected president. That seems very extreme.
Yeah, it's definitely very extreme, and I think it's something that the Conservative Party and conservative media has been working pretty hard for several years now, right? This didn't just start happening when Yoon Suk Yeol declared martial law. They've been at this for since 2022 and before then. Really, it goes back to Moon Jae-in and rapprochement with North Korea during the 2018-2019 summit meetings. So this has been something that the Conservative Party has been kind of trying to hammer home really since, before, for decades, really, right? If you're seen as somebody who is trying to negotiate with North Korea, to make deals with them, to do anything but try to make the North Korean regime collapse, then you are a threat to the South Korean state. And that goes all the way back to the founding of the Republic of Korea and Lee Seung-man in 1948. So Lee Jae-myung is just the next in a long line of opposition leaders who have had this tag put on them, right? Kim Dae-jung was sentenced to death basically for being an opposition party and, arguing that South Korea should open up dialogue with North Korea. So Lee Jae-myung is just the next one to have that tag put on him in a way.
What do you make of the conspiracy theories of China's involvement in trying to upset the system here in Korea, that China may be funding Lee Jae-myung, the Democratic Party, and there's been very disturbing scenes recently of politicians, of the constitutional justices, journalists, police officers, people going up to them and accusing them of either being Chinese or having Chinese heritage or family members that are Chinese. What do you make of how people have been reacting to those kind of theories as well?
Right. So I guess one thing that's been happening in South Korea really since 2016 in the THAAD dispute, um, as North Korea has become more obviously a failed state, they just aren't the big boogeyman that they used to be, right, in the Cold War era. And so the Conservative Party has been trying to include China into this, kind of communist boogeyman story because they need a more threatening aura, right? Kim Jong-un has nuclear weapons, but he doesn't have the resources to carry out some sort of large scale spy operation in South Korea anymore. Nobody really believes that. But China does, right? You can make that argument about China. And indeed, many people around the world are making those types of arguments, right? We have stories about the Chinese having these secret police stations all around the world to keep tabs on what their citizens are doing and also any sort of anti Chinese movement. So this is an easier argument to make and something that people could more easily believe in when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party. And then once the shine kind of rubbed off in terms of China being an economic opportunity with the THAAD dispute, many people in South Korea, right? South Korean people overwhelmingly, not only conservatives, but people who describe themselves as progressive, are also very anti-China at the moment because
especially
of the
young
THAAD.
people,
Yeah,
right?
especially young people. So it's a very easy way for the Conservative Party to try to entice people to persuade them to be on their side because it encapsulates basically all of Korea right now, this anti-Chinese sentiment. So going that route is a very um, aggressive and potentially successful political strategy to garner more votes, I would say.
Right. It's been quite extreme, though. It's been quite a switch. Suddenly, everyone and anyone being accused of being Chinese, having Chinese heritage. It's like something like like Invasion of the Body Snatchers or something like that. It's like I guess McCarthyism on steroids, something
Right.
like that.
Yeah, it's a very McCarthyist movement, but then again, it's not that different in terms of South Korea's long political history, right? In the Cold War era, if you had family members that went north, if you were accused of having fought for the North Korean army in the war, you were, an outsider. You were an outcast in society. And so this is really just the new version of that. If you have those relationships or even accused of having those relationships with China, the same thing is being done to you as it was done during the Cold War era to people who had any sort of relationship with North Korea.
Okay, let's try to wrap things up by bringing it back to, I guess, where we started with the impeachment trial and President Yoon. So, how do you think the impeachment vote will land?
He's going to be impeached, I think. And the reason I think that is that although we've had a lot of narrative in the media about details, did he give an order to drag people out of the National Assembly? Did he have this list of politicians he wanted to be arrested? And we have conflicting testimony about that. The simple fact remains that the declaration of martial law itself was unconstitutional, right? You can't talk your way out of that, I don't think. There was no emergency, there was no state of war that would have justified the declaration of martial law. I'm not a legal scholar, but in my somewhat uninformed opinion, there's no way to wiggle your way out of that. The declaration of martial law was illegal. The martial law decree that suspended political activities and tried to close the National Assembly was unconstitutional. So the details, while they are important, interesting, sexy things to talk about, the core of martial law was unconstitutional. And that, to me, I don't know how you get around that as a judge and not say that Yoon Suk Yeol should be impeached on that alone.
I'm just been reminded of uh, last the last arguments that President Yoon gave, and he talked about that if he were to return to office, that he would pursue constitutional reform. What did you make of that?
He's seemed like he's trying to run an election campaign, right? Like, are the judges going to vote for me? And that's not how this works, right? They aren't going to make your decision about impeachment based on what you will do.
Mm.
They make their decision in a perfect world about what you did, right? And the legality of your actions. So he can say all he wants and try to, appeal to the people that he will be a good president going forward. But that's not what impeachment is about. It's about what he did on December 3rd, December 4th, and the constitutionality of that And to me, it was clearly unconstitutional.
So if we assume that President Yoon will be impeached, because I think if we think about the possibility of him being not impeached, I think that opens way too many talking points. I think it's almost hard to imagine. But if we, just for today, just imagine that he is going to be impeached, how do you think this martial law incident and this impeachment and President Yoon's presidency will be looked back on in the future? What sort of how do you see it in the context of modern Korean history?
So when Park Geun-hye was impeached, there was a lot of commentary that we were hoping that this was going to open a new era in Korean politics, right? That moving forward, people are going to kind of put their political differences aside, try to strengthen Korean democracy, make some changes. It was a very rosy outlook at that time. And I think many people are not making those same arguments today, that this is taking South Korea in a even more dangerous direction. It has political polarization was a problem before martial law, but it's really inflamed it to an extremely acute level. And, you know, it's dangerous in the immediate aftermath. The day that Yoon Suk Yeol his impeachment announcement is given, whether he's impeached or not, there's going to be, you know, depending on what you believe those polls are right or not, maybe almost half of the Korean population is going to be very upset, right? And where do we go from there? You know, we're seeing where that can take us a little bit in the United States down a very dangerous path of slow erosion of democracy rather than the quick erosion that Yoon Suk Yeol's martial law decree would have been. So I think there's a very difficult and dangerous time coming for South Korea, and whether they can really start to put their differences aside, start to compromise and function in a way that democracy's supposed to function, or whether the two sides are just going to continue to see the other as an existential threat and try to undermine what they're doing in any way. And so it's, going to be very concerning moving forward either way, because I think half of Korea, maybe a little bit less than half, is going to be upset either way. Many people won't accept this decision and will be trying to fight, you know, tooth and nail against whatever comes afterwards.
Do you think this will deepen then the divisions between the two sides?
That's what I see coming, unfortunately. I thought there was a potential right after martial law was declared and put down. It seemed like there was a short breath where everybody was uniformly against martial law, but then that quickly disappeared. And now we're back to kind of where we began in terms of polarization, but even worse sense, because now it really does look like an existential threat where both sides are just going to be trying to rip the other out of office.
So I think that does smoothly lead us into the next segment, which is listeners' questions. So this is a new segment that I'm introducing for this podcast now. The listeners' questions, which, as the title suggests, I want to encourage the listeners to join in by asking a question to myself and our guest, and we will try to answer it as best as we can. Now, as this was the first time we're doing this, I reached out to some people I know and who are interested in Korean politics, and they gave me some questions. And so the first question is from Namu Yun in Canada, and he asks, why does the PPP still support President Yoon? That's the ruling People Power Party. That's President Yoon's party. Do you think they will continue to support him if he is impeached?
So I think the PPP has a severe hangover from the Park Geun-hye impeachment. What happened after Park Geun-hye was impeached is that the Conservative Party was torn in two, right? You had a group that were very supportive of her and were against her impeachment, like much of the PP is today. And then you had another group that was, 합리적 보수, or kind of rational conservatives who wanted to, assert conservative values and ideology in politics, but not in a way that was against democracy, right? So they were supportive of the democratic framework of government while being conservative. And because because the Conservative Party split in two, their election prospects were destroyed, right? They had no way to defeat Moon Jae-in in the election that came afterwards. They
And
found
ironically, if you put those two conservative parties together, they had a bigger vote share than Moon Jae-in did, right?
exactly. And also, they struggled in the elections, the general election that followed several years later, and they continue to struggle. But the lawmakers are mostly interested in one thing, right? Staying in office, right? That's how you retain your power. So they know that if they split apart, that all of their futures are going to be in danger. So I think for the most part, they are trying to prevent this disintegration into two parties. And the majority of the lawmakers, just as with Park Geun-hye as well, even were supportive of the president. They're their standard bearer, right? If you forsake them, then what are we? So a majority are, trying to push for the party to remain together, and in consequence, they're trying to push others out, right? If you're taking this position against Yoon Suk Yeol, they're trying to remove them from the party. People like Kim Sang-mok, who was very vocal about being pro-impeachment back in December. But yeah, I think the PPP's main goal right now is to stay as one party, not fragment into two, to ensure that they have a successful election strategy moving forward.
We briefly covered this last week as well, but Professor Cho Hee-kyung said that she reckons the party will flip once President Yoon is impeached by the Constitutional Court. She thinks the party will move on, essentially. I'm not so sure because they've dug their heels in so deep with supporting President Yoon. But what do you think?
I think it's
going to be so hard to switch what they've been saying until now, right?
The primary for choosing the candidate in the election is going to be very interesting for the PPP. You're going to have people like Kim Moon-soo, who has been very supportive of Yoon, probably running. You're going to have people like Oh Se-hoon, the mayor of Seoul, who has been less supportive, right? He came out immediately on December 3rd as being against martial law and hasn't been supportive of Yoon very much since. So which candidate kind of wins that the race for the presidential candidate of the party is going to really take the party in one direction or the other. And so that'll be interesting to see internally within the PPP when they start to do their own polling, right, to determine the candidate. Where is the PPP itself on the issue of Yoon's impeachment? If the majority of people participating in the primary election pull the PPP in that extreme direction, then they could easily continue to stay on the path they are today. If realizing that their only chance to probably win an election is to take the more moderate road and to select somebody like Oh Se-hoon as their candidate, then they would probably be more likely to flip. I can see why Professor Joe would think they would flip, because I think it really is the more successful election strategy. Whether it's 50%, whether it's 60 or 70, a majority of Koreans, I really believe, think that Yoon should be impeached and will not vote for anybody who thinks otherwise. Whether they hate Jae-myung or not, they will not want somebody in power who thinks that that's okay, right? So if we're just talking about winning office, and if we believe that politicians' core interest is remaining in office or taking power, then I think the PPP will flip on their position and choose a candidate who's against impeachment and kind of abandon Yoon.
Right. I think in times of uncertainty, it happens a lot, but political parties turn to their core supporters. They're more worried about making sure that they keep hold of what they have rather than trying to gain new ground. And so perhaps for me, that's how I've seen how the PPP have reacted. Whether they'll be able to successfully flip, they might flip, but as you said, I'm not convinced that the Korean public will be convinced by their move to flip. I think that's the conventional thinking, but there's been so much which has been quite
Uh-oh.
Okay, so it seems like the camera is struggling. So let's try to wrap things up quickly. Let's just move on to our second question now. So this comes from Michael Welch in the US. So he asks, Are the Korean Democratic Party struggles analogous to the struggles of the US Democratic Party? How similar or different are their struggles? I'm guessing he's referring to the fact that they can't seem to get past more than 40-50% in the polls. And yet they are struggling somewhat.
I think it's really different situation. The Democratic Party for the past two general elections has done very well, right? And they have an overwhelming majority in the National Assembly, where the Democrat Party, just lost both houses, right, in the U.S. Congress. And the other thing that's interesting about the Democratic Party in Korea is that strong regional support that it has in Jeolla, that it can really count on. So they, of course, the kind of urban rural thing is sort of a issue in Korea, but not like it is in the United States. There is a block, a small block to be sure, but a block of voters in South Korea that show no signs of turning away from the Democratic Party. So they always have these very core constituent base in the Southwest. They are also doing very well in Seoul for the most part. So they're performing very well when it comes to the National Assembly. They also don't have to worry about cobbling together these different coalitions that the United States Democratic Party has to do with, in terms of whether it's race or gender, trying to get these diverse groups together to kind of support their party by making all these different various policies. So the Democratic Party in Korea, I think, has a much easier path to keeping itself electorally viable and controlling the National Assembly. In any presidential system, you'll have difficulties in the presidential election, depending on if you're in or out of power and, how satisfied the electorate is with the economic situation, for example. But the Democratic Party looks very strong right now in terms of the National Assembly, which is good news for them and something the Democratic Party in the U.S. cannot say.
Indeed. I mean, just the sheer number of lawmakers they have in the National Assembly. The Democratic Party, on one hand, aren't struggling at all when it comes to the National Assembly, but it is the Jae-myung factor when it comes to the presidential race. That is the question whether he can win over enough people. He should be able to win enough people, as we said, especially with everything that happened with Yoon Suk Yeol and the PPP. But the fact that his likability is still so low, it does remain. There is still hope for the PPP. That's what they're clinging on to, really,
Yes.
his unfavorability rather than the PPP's favorability at the moment. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it for today. Before we go, tell us, what are your plans for your year ahead and, what you're looking to research and teach, and can you just tell us a bit more?
So my first semester at Dankook University as an assistant professor, very excited about that. I'm going to be teaching Korean politics this semester, which will be interesting, mostly foreign exchange students. So trying to introduce them to the mess that is Korean politics today should be quite the challenge. But also really looking forward. I mentioned the paper I'm writing with colleague Kieran about looking at the historical parallels and how a lot has changed, but a lot hasn't changed in Korean politics over the years, especially pre and post 1987. And so doing more of that research, me and other colleagues, we put together a panel of papers in November of last year about authoritarianism and Korea's, kind of lessons for the world in terms of this democratic backsliding we're seeing all around the world. And we would have never imagined that South Korea would change and martial law would happen. So looking forward to some academic conferences this summer and talking about authoritarianism, democratic backsliding, and Korea's current experiences, so to say.
And what I just want to squeeze in at the end here as well, one of the things I really enjoyed about your writings and respected about you as well was that you are someone who clearly did your research in Korean as well. You were looking at Korean first-hand sources. And that might sound obvious to a lot of people, but that hasn't always been the case, unfortunately, when it comes to foreign professors and foreign researchers coming to Korea and writing about Korea, right?
Yeah, that's been a struggle in international Korean studies for a long time, especially when it comes to history and politics. It's easy to get resources, especially from the U.S., that are all in English. But of course, when you do that, you're getting that filter, right? That outsider's perspective and what they understand, and then reporting their limited understanding to their home governments or whatever it is, the media. So getting the analysis and data straight from Korean sources, I think, is something that, to be fair, is a direction that Korean studies and as a whole is going these days. So that's a positive trend. Definitely seeing a lot more foreigners coming to Korea who can speak Korean. I think even when I first came 15 years ago, if you could say "안녕하세요," Koreans were, blown out of their mind. Wow, you speak Korean, thank you. But now nobody cares, right? You're expected to speak Korean, and that's a very welcome change, I would say.
Yeah, I saw an interview with a US historian. Her name was Sarah Payne. She's, I think, a historian at the US Naval War College, and she was talking about how when an academic book about China or history is not worth your time is when you turn to the bibliography and there are no Chinese or Russian first-hand sources
Yes.
in the bibliography. But that must be quite a challenge for you as well, researching in Korean.
It's got its challenges, certainly. One of the reasons that it's not the only reason, it's my interest, but if I were to go back in time further to the colonial era or Joseon era, I would start to have to learn a lot more Chinese characters. So doing research on the 70s and 80s when everybody's using Hangul makes my life a lot easier, that's for sure.
Yes, we'll say that's not the only reason.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, we're going to bring this interview to an end now. Now, like last week with Professor Cho, there was so much more that I wanted to talk about with you today, but it's been absolutely fascinating to pick your brain on these subjects today. We really appreciate it. Professor Engel, thank you so much for your time today, and hopefully we'll speak to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So that was Professor Benjamin Engel. Some really interesting observations there, I would say, making those connections through Korea's history, that President Yoon's decision to declare martial law didn't just come out of nowhere, that there is context to it all. So yes, I would say definitely continue to look out for his observations and writings in the future. Well, that's it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'll be back next week with another really interesting guest, Subin Kim, a journalist with Reporters Without Borders currently, formerly of the BBC, and also the author of an English language newsletter on Korean politics called Korea Context. That's context with a K. Again, he is someone who offers a fascinating insight into Korean politics, but from a more Korean perspective. You'll hopefully know what I mean when you hear from him next week. And in the meantime, please send me any questions or thoughts on Korean politics to discuss on the show. Send them to koreanpoliticsdebrief@gmail.com. Well, that's it. This show has been produced, written, edited, published, stressed over, and financed by myself, Kwon Jang-woo. Thank you for listening, and bye for now.